Hello and welcome to this how-to video for Instant ID. In this video, I will be demonstrating how to configure database connections within the Instant ID software. Instant ID supports the following data source types: CSV data import and web services are covered in separate how-to videos. There is no need to use external database connectivity tools such as the ODBC Data Source Administrator in order to connect Instant ID to databases. Simply configure your database connection within the Instant ID software by clicking on the gear icon, Settings, and Data Sources. Click on the Create button to configure a new database connection, or if you wish to use Active Directory as a data source, click on the Directory Services tab and click on Create. Included in all editions of Instant ID is a default database, which you can use if you do not have your own database. By default, all new Quick Start Wizard sessions and new workflows that you design will use the default database. I will show you how to configure your workflow to use a different database later on in the video. If you have designed a workflow and you wish to use a table within the default database with that workflow, click on Design, Field Connections, select your workflow from the drop-down list, then click on Manage Table, give the table a name, then select a workflow field that will be used as the primary key field in the table and click Create. The table is created, all fields between the workflow and the new table are connected for you. Simply click Save. Then in the Properties for your workflow, under Search Configuration, select at least one workflow field to be used as a searchable field within the new table and click Save. The workflow is now connected to the table and can be used to enroll new records which can be saved to that table. And you can also search the new table. The first database we will configure is a Microsoft Access database. Begin by giving the data source configuration a name. Then select Microsoft Access from the drop-down list. You then have two methods of connecting to the database. If you know the JDBC URL string, then you can select URL. If you do not know the JDBC URL string, select Properties. I will provide an example of connecting to a database using a JDBC URL string later in the video. For an Access database connection, we need to provide the full file path. So I browse to the location of my database. I copy the file path and I paste the file path into the box provided. I then copy the full name of the database, including the file extension. I add a backslash to the end of the file path and paste the name of the database at the end of the file path. If my database required a password, I could enter it here, then click Test Connection, and once successful, click Save. Next, we will configure a Microsoft SQL database connection. However, the following process can also be applied when configuring a database connection for a DB2 database or a MySQL database. Give the database configuration a name, select Microsoft SQL Server from the drop-down list, select Properties, and enter the details in order to access the Microsoft SQL database. These details can be provided by your database administrator. Then click Test Connection and save. Next, we will configure an Oracle database connection. Give the database configuration a name, select Oracle from the drop-down list, and enter the details required to access the Oracle database. The only difference between the details entered for a Microsoft SQL Server database and an Oracle database are that you need to enter a service name or SID value rather than the database name. Then click Test Connection, and once successful, click Save. Next, we will configure the same SQL Server database connection as we did previously, but this time we're going to use the JDBC URL string to connect to the database. After giving the database configuration name and selecting Microsoft SQL Server from the drop-down list, click the URL button and begin to enter the JDBC URL string. For a SQL Server JDBC URL string, begin with JDBC : SQL Server : / followed by the IP address or host name of the server, port number, semicolon, database name equals, followed by the name of the database. Then enter the user ID and password. Then click the Test Connection button, and once successful, click Save. Next, we will configure Active Directory as a data source. To do this, select the Directory Services tab and click Create. Give the data source configuration a name, select the communication protocol used by your Active Directory server. There is only one directory service type to choose from the drop-down list, which is Active Directory. Then enter the IP address or host name of the server which hosts the Active Directory service. Enter the port number used by the directory server. Port 389 is provided by default. Then enter the user and password to access the Active Directory service. The format in which your username is entered will depend on the way the user accounts are configured within the Active Directory that you are configuring the data source for. Next, select the search scope from the drop-down list. The options are base, entire subtree, or one level. Next, you need to enter the values that create the search base. Lastly, enter the search attribute which will be used to identify unique records in the Active Directory. The database administrator should be able to provide you the information to create this configuration. Once all information is entered, click Test Configuration, and once successful, click Save. By default, the built-in H2 database is configured as the primary data source. This means that any new workflows that are configured to use the primary data source will use the built-in H2 data source by default. You can configure one of your other data source configurations as the primary data source by editing the configuration, entering a password if one is required, then checking the box called Make this the primary database. Click the Test Connection button and then click Save. My Oracle database is now my primary data source. Now when I configure a new workflow, by default it will use the Oracle database as the data source. Alternatively, you can keep the built-in H2 database as the primary data source, and in your workflow select Properties and Data Sources to configure the workflow to use a different data source type: database, directory service, or web service. I've selected database and I'm choosing the Oracle database. I could, if I wanted to, configure a different data source connection for my target database. I then configure my search fields accordingly and connect my workflow fields to the table fields. The workflow is then ready to use with the table. That completes this demonstration. Thank you for watching.